Hey, what's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Roll Pod, an Alabama sports podcast from Bama 247. I'm your host, Cody Goodwin. Got the whole gang here, Alex Scarborough and Mike Rodak, to recap, kind of, Alabama's 52-7 win over Mercer. Crimson Tide now 8-2 overall this season. 2 games left in the regular season. They're going to go on the road to Oklahoma this upcoming week, and then they'll return home to play Auburn in the Iron Bowl following Thanksgiving. But we're here to recap the annual late season FCS beatdown for the Crimson Tide. Like I said, 52-7 over Mercer. This was largely expected. Give the Tide a little bit of credit for working on some things on offense, I suppose, continuing to take the ball away on defense. We got to see Graham Nicholson kick a 45-yard field goal, and he made it. We got to see a lot of younger players, and we'll touch on this here in a little bit, play on both offense and defense. But as we always do, I always want to start with just kind of the biggest takeaway or the thing that jumped out to us the most, just kind of off the top of the head reaction to the result on Saturday. Alex, I'll let you start. Alabama 52, Mercer 7. What was your biggest takeaway?
Man, I mean, it was they did what they had to do. Like I wrote it, the lead of the instant analysis was ho hum. It was drama free, get in, get out, get on with life. You do get meaningful reps, if you can call them that, for younger guys, which is important for development. But in terms of what this past game means for future games, I think it is limited at best. But you get out with no injuries, you move on. You just wonder. The thing I wonder a little bit about is, like, where's the mindset? You have a big game, Mercer, you let off the gas. Now you got to ramp back up for an Oklahoma team that, while they're significant underdogs on the road, is going to be a little bit challenging. They seem to have the right headspace, but to me, that's more where my concern is at.
No, I think that's fair, and we'll discuss that as we kind of look ahead here later on in the show. But I agree. Like, Alabama showed up, they took care of business, they got out without any injuries, right? Like I mentioned, good on the offense for working on a couple of things, right? They ran the ball pretty well. They worked on their downfield passing game. Good on the defense, 3 more takeaways, 24 for the season, 16 over the last 5 games, which you can look at whoever they've played and shrug your shoulders if you want to, but that's a lot of output. That's pretty good, I would argue. Good on the second and third string guys. Again, we'll touch on those guys here in a little bit. Mike, what was your kind of initial reaction to 52-7?
It was there. I mean, I don't know. As far as FCS games go, it wasn't ever in doubt, but like, I feel like Mercer did a few more things than I typically have seen from FCS teams, which they're a good FCS team. We talked about that all last week. So
you're the one that grinded the Mercer tape. What stuck out to you about what the Bears did?
I mean, they actually moved the ball offensively better than I thought. They really got screwed by themselves, by their own turnovers, by the interception that the QB threw when he was just jailbreak blitzed and he crapped his pants and he just threw the ball over the middle to Quay Russo, who made a really good play on it. You know, they had 2 fumbles after the catch, I believe, or after the run, that they were moving the ball, I think, in both cases before that. And that was their backup quarterback. That's a freshman backup for Mercer. That I think started 13 of 15 for 138 yards, 1 touchdown.
He hit 14 of his first 16 passes to start the game.
Right. And their defense, I mean, actually didn't perform quite as well as I thought. I thought Alabama would just slice right through them, with the exception of that one early punt in the second quarter. You know, the 3-and-out that Alabama had. They did have one more 3-and-out. That was with the second team offense, though. Or they had one more punt, I should say. That was with the second team offense in the third quarter. So actually, Mercer's defense didn't show up quite to the level I thought they would. But overall, the starters played probably a little bit longer than I think people would have expected. You know, the offense went halfway through the third quarter. The starting defense was on the field pretty late in the third quarter, a little bit longer. And as I said last week, I feel like it's always a little bit overrated, kind of the idea of we're going to see all these players. And we did. We saw a lot of players, but there's going to be a lot to take away from that. I don't think there really is. I mean, I was looking at last year's box score. You know, Ty Simpson had a 78-yard run against Chattanooga. That was the one where he dropped the ball right before the end zone. And
who could forget?
I'm thinking of the young guys who had catches in that game. I mean, we got Cole Adams, 2 catches for 11 yards last year. Malik Benson showed up, 3 catches for 23 yards. Amari Niblack, 2 catches for 24 yards. Man, those guys are helping Alabama this year. Oh, wait, they're not. Isaiah Bond had 4. Danny Lewis had a catch in last year's game. How about some of these plays these dudes made last year? Sean Murphy had a couple tackles. He's helping Alabama this year. Trey Amos. So it's like, these guys are going to be gone. Like, the seniors who played in this game are going to be gone. The guys who are playing in the NFL are going to be in the NFL draft are going to be gone. And some of these young players, even as much as they played in this game, could be out the door too, especially if they didn't capitalize on what they felt was a big opportunity for them. And I'm sure there's players that feel that way. Caleb Odom dropping or not hauling in, if you want to put it that way, the touchdown catch in the end zone. Probably didn't have the sort of game that he would want to stand out. He finished with 2 catches for 20 yards on 4 targets. Some of these players might have thought they actually had a bigger chance in this game, and they didn't. So my takeaway is that I didn't quite have enough or get enough to take away from the backups, because I thought the starters played a little bit longer. Even Kalen DeBoer said, like, you guys might think the game is over, but they're still playing as if the game is in doubt deep into the third quarter, which I thought is an astute way of looking at it, but obviously results in less playing time for the backups.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And that's one of the things that I did want to get to on today's show, because again, you look at 52-7, you look at all the different guys that played, the result was never really in doubt. Not a ton really to learn from a matchup like this. You just hope they get in and out. They work efficiently. They don't get hurt and they move forward, which is generally what this FCS matchup in late November has turned into for Alabama, kind of a glorified bye week. But one thing I did want to get into, 49 different players saw at least one snap on offense. 32 different players saw at least one snap on defense. Total together, right? 81 different players played a snap between offense and defense. A lot of those guys, obviously second, third, for some position groups, maybe 4th stringers finally got on the field. Maybe didn't play a ton, but they got to play some. I guess I'll throw it back to you, Alex. Was there a younger guy or a guy that doesn't normally play a lot that maybe caught your attention for better or for worse?
Not really. I mean, because so many guys played, it wasn't like the second string guys got a ton of run. Like, it just bled second string into third string into 4th string, and it was boom, it's over. The guy who you thought might flash a little bit would be Ty Simpson, because he had opportunities, but to me, he really didn't. And some of that's probably just hand the ball off. He had the big pass to Cuevas, but that was just chuck the ball up and hope for the best. He just looked kind of like what we've come to expect from Ty. Not bad, not great. So, I mean, Richard Young had himself a decent game, but there wasn't anybody out there who really was like, oh my goodness, I got to pay attention to him. Some of that on defense, I wonder, is a function of what Mercer does offensively, running the football, short passes. They kind of eliminate the pass rush a little bit, but yeah, there was nobody who I came away thinking, oh, here we go. Just wasn't, I don't think the game really set up that way.
Right. Yeah, I was just looking at last year's box score. I mean, Christian Story had an interception in last year's game. He's helping Alabama this year. Actually, he was with Kentucky. Caleb Downs had an 85-yard punt return for a touchdown last year.
We wrote about that, by the way.
Right. Really sign of things to come for Alabama in 2025, obviously, or 2024.
Could use Christian Story, to be fair.
Right, I mean, they probably could.
This team could also use a Caleb Downs. Let's be
right. And obviously, some of those guys that left, was Saban related, but Christian Story wasn't. The Christian Story was gone before Saban was retired. Point being, like, again, some of these guys that got into the game are actually just putting film on tape for other schools to look at when they go into the portal. That's just the reality of this. But I will say Richard Young was probably the first name that came to mind. But then I was going back and looking at his stats. All right, 7 carries for 26 yards, 3.7 yard average. He did have a couple of short yardage situations. He had a 3rd and 1 where he got 2 yards. That's a positive play. Had a 1st and goal where he scored. That's a positive play. Had a 4th and 1 where he got 2 yards. That's a positive play. So that, his average looks worse, but those plays were successful. 1st and 15 ran for 8 yards. 1st and 10 ran for 9 yards. Did have a stop for no gain on 2nd and 7, but overall looked pretty decent. And that's a player that I think is in a really interesting spot, because you don't know what's going to happen with Justice Haynes and Jam Miller. They can both be back next year. Like, there's nothing stopping them. I don't know if either one of them is really in a position to go to the NFL right now. And it's just a question of whether they want to continue to do the committee thing at Alabama. And if one of those guys leaves, then maybe that opens up a spot for Richard Young to play more next year. If both of those guys are still here in 2025, I'm not sure Richard Young is here, because I don't know if it makes sense for Richard Young to stay for a third year and be the number 3 running back, especially when you have AK Deer coming in. You have Daniel Mountain, Hill, Stonehands. He did have a pretty bad drop. Like, Kevin Riley, and then you just lost Turbo Rogers today, which was, expected, the 2025 commit. But you still have a pretty crowded running back room. So I don't know where Young really fits unless you lose one of Haynes or Miller. But that's probably the player that would have stood out. I mean, I thought Rico Scott made a good catch.
Richard Young in his last 3 games has 16 carries for 120-ish yards and 2 touchdowns. So he's putting together a little bit of tape where I wonder if he's building towards something here, or to Mike's point, is he building towards something elsewhere?
Right. I just would tend to doubt that carries over past the Auburn game. I mean, he probably will have some opportunities if Alabama doesn't mess around at Oklahoma and Auburn to get some more carries. But after that, you're probably just sticking with your top 2 guys. I think that's what they were doing, most of the year when things were tight. So you're advertising yourself pretty well, I think, for other teams. It's just you need something to happen in front of you at Alabama if you're going to play.
Right. I think running back's one of those positions that kind of circle that with a red pen and be like, all right, that's when this regular season gets over and the portal opens and we start to see a little bit of movement. And that's just one position or group I think that's going to be worth monitoring for the reasons that you laid out. I thought it was interesting. We made this game interesting. I know I said this on the pregame pod. We made it interesting in the offseason because we thought we could potentially see the quarterbacks play quite a bit. We saw 5 quarterbacks play. Cade Carruth got in the final moments and just handed the ball off. But we did see all 4 quarterbacks throw passes. Kalen DeBoer even made comment on it after the game. Obviously, Milroe started the game. Then we got to see Ty Simpson. Then it went Dylan Lonergan, Austin Mack. Lonergan went 5 of 6 for 23 yards. Austin Mack went 2 of 3, 39 yards and a touchdown pass to Rico Scott. Ty Simpson, we mentioned before, 5 of 10, 71 yards. Nothing overly impressive. Do we have any additional thoughts on the quarterbacks? Like, what do we think of the way that they played? Or was it just maybe too small of a sample size to have any sort of, sweeping opinions on them?
Probably too small of a sample size, but I will say I'd love to see Ty Simpson just stand in the pocket, set his feet, and throw the football. It always looks a little bit hurried when he's in there. And Johnny Manziel did that and won a freaking Heisman. But it is interesting. Like, every time I see it, like, I thought the Mercer game would be a little bit of a different look. And it just, maybe that's just his game. That was the one thing that sort of jumped out to me. Is like, he always seems to be a little bit on the run, even when he's standing still.
Yes to your question. I think it's a very small sample size. It's obviously a decimal point fraction of what they've done for the entire year in practice in terms of their reps. And so I don't want to make any, broad generalizations on 6 passes for Lonergan or 3 for Mack when they've thrown hundreds, if not thousands of passes the last couple months. So I agree with that on Ty. Like, I think in 3 years now, we've seen him in some capacity in a spring game or, games like this where he loves to just scramble and he has a lot of confidence in it. And sometimes it's worked out. I don't know if it would consistently work out if you're talking about him playing against Georgia or Tennessee or, actual real opponents and real meaningful moments. Like, he turns his back to the field a lot to spin around the edge, tries to turn the corner when he's scrambling, and it worked for a first down in this game. I just don't know if that's going to work a lot. And I think when you have that sort of confidence and you're not Jalen Milroe, which he's not, that's going to bite you. And I would agree with Ty. Like, I agree with Ty. I agree with Alex that I'd rather have Ty just be more of a passer than trying to do what he's doing, that he's consistently done, not just in this offense, not just in Tommy Rees's offense, but going back to Bill O'Brien's offense. And like, run some RPO stuff with him, just have him stand there and just throw the ball. Like, if you have the arm talent, if you have the accuracy, like, make that your thing. Don't try to be Johnny Manziel. Don't try to be whatever you're trying to be. which I feel like he's doing too much. But again, it's such a small sample size that he could be doing that in practice every single day. We just don't see it. But when the lights are on, that's kind of what we've seen.
And you don't have the first team offensive line. You don't have the first team receivers. It's very hard to judge him. But again, it's emerged as a sort of trend whenever we've seen that's kind of his style of play, and it doesn't not exactly what I expected. Let's say.
I think the other thing too that I think about when I think of like Ty Simpson and the small sample size that we've gotten of him, and especially the last couple of years, the offense has been built for Jalen Milroe, and they're not going to overhaul it for 2, 3, 4 possessions against an FCS school at the end of the season. Now they're probably going to have like certain sub packages. Like I'm sure that there were 10, 12 plays that they were going to try to get through with Ty, maybe more at the end of the game or in the third quarter, whenever it is that he came in. But like, when everybody else is kind of operating under this is the Jalen Milroe offense, and then you put Ty in there, who is a very different quarterback. He's a little bit more of a traditional drop back passer who has some running ability, but like very clearly the offense is built around Milroe's ability to run the ball and how that affects everything else. Like it makes it really hard for me to watch Ty go 5 of 10 for 71 yards and think, yeah, he can run this offense, because it's totally different players, 2 totally different offenses. And it's almost like they're working out of 2 totally separate playbooks, which makes me wonder, whenever Milroe does move on, I'm assuming it's going to be at the end of this season, where he's probably going to go off to the NFL, and we'll see what happens with that. But like starting next spring, like unless something drastically changes that we just can't foresee right now, that's when they'll start to really build the Ty Simpson offense, or an offense built around Ty Simpson's skill sets, because we're presuming that he's probably going to be QB1 starting in the spring. So then what does that offense look like? I think it's going to look totally different from whatever we saw this past weekend against Mercer, what we saw in small moments against Chattanooga last year, and whenever else we've seen him over the last couple of years. I don't know. That was kind of a scatterbrain thought that I also had too, that it's really hard to get a full gauge on what he can do when he's not really fully running an offense that's suited for him.
To that point, I've watched a lot of Alabama football, and I wouldn't have told you Mac Jones was going to do Mac Jones things at Alabama. I sure as hell wouldn't have told you that Blake Sims was going to do the things he was going to do. How you look in a backup quarterback role can be very different than how you look in a starting role. So if it sounds like we're being negative, there's that piece of it, and there's also the piece that throughout the spring on in throughout the summer, continued optimism surrounding his future as a quarterback. I think it just bears. This is the evidence we have, and what we've seen looks like what it looks like.
To kind of tie a bow on 52-7, I thought it was cool that Rico Scott got out there and ran some routes. I thought it was cool to see Josh Cuevas get a little bit more shine. I know he really only had that one big catch, I suppose, that ultimately led to a touchdown, but it was kind of fun to just see him out on the field a little bit more. It was fun to see Robbie Oots like run, not quite a fly route, but basically a deep down the field route, 44-yard touchdown. Like that was kind of cool. It was also cool to hear the guys talk about, him in very glowing terms afterwards. Cause he's just, when you play tight end, unless you're Travis Kelce or Brock Bowers or whoever, like, unless you're one of those like superstar guys, you don't really get a lot of shine. So it was just kind of cool to see, a couple of those guys. I think even CJ Dupree had a couple of catches. Like it was fun to see the ball get spread around a little bit and a couple other guys do a couple other things, even if nobody really popped in the way that we were maybe hoping for in a game like this. So, and then even defensively, like you mentioned the Quay Russaw pick. I think there was Damon Payne recovered a fumble early on that came after Mercer converted, I think, a third down or whatever it was. We got to see Justin Okoronkwo play a little bit more. We got to see Zay Mincy collect a few more snaps at safety. Like we got to see a little bit here and there, but again, just, I don't know. It was kind of hard defensively, I suppose, to see how some of these guys, like, honestly, like the biggest takeaway from the defense was like, man, Deshaun Jones got beat on what was probably the play of the game, right? The one-handed catch for Mercer in that touchdown, and like really, really great throw, really, really great catch. And it's just like, at the time I remember thinking like, I hope that's not what we remember from the defensive performance, but like even on a day when they had 3 takeaways and Xavier Brown had that scoop and score, right, for 66 yards, Deshaun Jones getting beat was kind of what I remembered from the defensive performance. I don't know. I kind of feel bad saying that out loud, but that's,
because you said that in the press box, and my immediate thought was, yeah, he got beat, like technically speaking, but also like, what the hell was he supposed to do short of tackling the guy? Like, yes. It was a one-handed grab, barely within the receiver's reach. how is it going to be within the cornerback's reach? I don't really fault him a ton for that specific play.
Kalen DeBoer said on his TV show that he was in good position. So
Yeah.
take that. I also want to say that, Robbie Hoots has been a pretty big part of this offense. And I feel like before the season, I was trying to make that point, but y'all were just saying that Kendrick Law was going to be like the next Jerry Rice.
I like how he drops y'all when he tries to make a point.
I did not say Law was going to be the next Jerry Rice. And also, I'll have you know, I was the only one that wrote a tight end story during fall camp. So, yeah.
But I was just talking about how
I didn't think 12 personnel was going to happen.
Right. I said that they were probably going to run a lot of 2 tight end stuff. And
also, he's not a tight end. He's an H-back. But that's
right.
not the point.
Now, and just to put a bow on some of that, Kendrick Law finished this game with 2 touches, both running attempts on jet sweeps, -9 yards.
That was weird.
Prentice got into the game, made his first catch since Vandy, and had 2 catches for 8 yards on 3 targets, was playing out there with walk-ons in the late 4th quarter. Those are 2 guys that I would not really expect to be here next year, to be honest. They're both going to be seniors. This is their last chance coming up in 2025, and I just don't know what their role is right now. Like, I'm going to say disappointing, because I don't know if it's all their fault or even mostly their fault, but like the stats just aren't there. The production is not there for either one of those, especially Prentice, even without Cole Adams. So if I'm them, like, you really got to think, this is your last chance to make it to the NFL. I probably have to do it somewhere else next year.
Perhaps. I know they really like Law as a blocker, and especially with the offense, I know people are going to roll their eyes at that because he's a,
you're not going to get
gadgety player, and he's fantastic with the ball in his hands, especially on like kickoff returns, right? I think he had like a 20 or 30 yard kickoff return in this game too. Whatever. They value him as a down the field blocker, and we probably should have mentioned this on last week's show after Milroe popped off for 4 rushing touchdowns against LSU, but Law did a lot of work clearing some of those spaces down the field for Milroe to continue running on the 39-yard touchdown round, and then especially on the 72-yarder that basically put the fork in the Tigers. Like, Law was the only other guy down the field continuing to block defensive backs so that Milroe could spring free.
And that's great. And I think NFL teams will like that. But Kendrick Law has 33 catches for 300-something yards in 3 seasons of college football. He needs more production as a receiver if he wants to make his money at the next level.
So a counter thought to that.
It's a podcast. There's 3 of us on
counter thought to that. Would you rather go somewhere else just to be the guy, or would you rather stay and work with Jamarcus Shepard, who has routinely put guys in the league at receiver?
But that's, in offenses that like Western Kentucky, Purdue, like they were throwing the ball all over the yard, and they weren't doing it this year. Maybe they'll do it more next year. It's sort of a gamble. Especially, I was going to say the receivers they have coming in, that's no longer the case with Caleb Cunningham, but you still have theoretically Ryan Williams and Jeremy Bernard in this offense next year. If they go out in the portal and get somebody, like, it's a gamble. And I think you have to look, if you're Law, like, look at what Ja'Cory Brooks did, look what Javon Baker did.
Ja'Cory Brooks had the production before he was in Saban's doghouse.
Right. And Shaz Preston at Tulane, he has 2 catches for 80 yards this year, but that guys have left this offense. You might have a chance to do it someplace else. I just don't know. I can be here with Jamarcus Shepard next year. I can be a blocker. Like, as much as I think Kendrick Law does things the right way, I just don't know if being that unselfish is the best thing for him.
Not a lot of third receivers, and that's probably the ceiling of what he can be if Jeremy Bernard comes back. Not a lot of third receivers get drafted in the NFL.
Correct.
It doesn't happen. So in that
Just
respect,
something to think about.
Yeah. If we want to put a bow on it, though, the thing I will remember most from this game is Jeremy Bernard blocking one dude, seeing another dude, dropping him, and blocking another guy. That was the play of the game, in my opinion. The double block.
So I know that you probably asked him about this post game. I also asked him about this just to make sure that we got it on video. He was excited to explain that. And I don't know, that's a dude that takes a lot of pride in his blocking as a receiver. I thought that was kind of cool to see that.
He got a round of applause when they went over film today. I guarantee you.
Heck yeah. That's 52-7. The other thing I wanted to get to on today's show was the continually evolving SEC championship race. And we gained a lot of clarity, at least as it pertains to Alabama, with some of the results in the SEC, particularly with Georgia taking down Tennessee final 31-17 in Athens. That was the second loss and also second SEC loss for Tennessee. That kind of brings them back to the pack. So now you've got a group of 2-loss teams in Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, Ole Miss, which leaves Texas and Texas A&M as the 2 1-loss teams in the SEC. They will play in the regular season finale. But because Tennessee lost, the path for Alabama to get to Atlanta, fairly clear here. All they need over the next 2 weeks is, 1, they need to win out, which means wins over Oklahoma and Auburn. 2, they need Missouri to win 1 game against either Mississippi State or Arkansas. Seems likely. We'll continue to monitor because you just never know with the Tigers. You need Mizzou to win 1, and you need Alabama to win out, and they'll go to Atlanta for the SEC championship game against presumably either Texas or Texas A&M. Mike, you wrote a really long thing this morning on Bama 247 just about the idea of Alabama playing in Atlanta, playing for an SEC championship, what that potentially means to their playoff odds. You dove into it in significantly more detail than what I just explained, also a lot clearer detail than the way I just explained it. Just what are your continually evolving thoughts when it pertains to Alabama, the SEC race, the playoff at all?
The only way that Georgia would get in over Alabama would be if Missouri loses its last 2 games. But it would also be a case of if Tennessee loses to Vandy, then Alabama would still get in. So point being, there's a very, very, very high likelihood that Alabama's in the SEC championship game if it wins its final 2 games. If it loses a game, then we're back to talking about the Gator Bowl or Las Vegas Bowl because they're not going to be in the SEC championship game and they're not going to be in the playoff.
That's why number 1 on their to-do list is to win out.
Right. But if they do, like, it's almost like a moot point. Like this whole debate of like, would you want to play in the SEC championship game or not is almost becoming moot at this point because there isn't really much of a path for Alabama to not make the SEC championship game, but still be in the playoff. So that whole debate is really almost fading away now. And it's really the 2 likeliest scenarios are you go to the SEC championship game, you win, you get a top 2 seed, really. I mean, they're not going to put you behind an ACC winner or a Big 12 or Group of 5 winner. So you're getting a top 2 seed in a first round bye. Or you lose the SEC championship game and you're 10-3 and you're kind of at the mercy of the committee. I tend to think you would still be in, but it's a really interesting comparison when you're looking at them versus Georgia versus Tennessee versus Ole Miss versus Indiana versus Notre Dame. You're probably not going to catch up to Penn State or, the loser of Oregon, Ohio State at that point. But it's very, very unlikely that you would host a playoff game as the SEC championship game loser at 10-3. That would be very, very difficult to get a 5-8 seed. So you're going on the road, 9-12 is where you would almost certainly be. So those are your 2 likeliest scenarios are you win the SEC championship, you have a first round bye or top 2 seed, or you lose it and you're going on the road in the playoff, which is really where they are anyway. I mean, that's kind of without the SEC championship game put into the equation, that's kind of where they are. I mean, based on today's polls, and the committee will have its own rankings Tuesday night, but right now in both coaches and AP poll, they would be the 9 seed. They would go on the road to Notre Dame. But that has all kind of become pointless to try to dive into that right now because, like I said, they're going to Atlanta. Like Alabama's going to Atlanta or bust. They're losing one of these next 2 games. Like that's where they're at.
Alex, how do we feel about the idea of Alabama going to Atlanta, competing for an SEC championship, what it potentially means for their playoff standing? Do you have any thoughts on this?
You could have sold me on an argument that Alabama would have want to avoid the SEC championship only under the auspices that they would therefore host a first round game. The fact that they're now in this position where it's either you win and you get a bye or you lose and you play on the road, obviously you want to win and you want to play, you want to get the bye. So to Mike's point, it's kind of a moot point at this point. With that said, it's going to be something we're going to have to monitor every single year because these things are going to get tricky, and it is going to get to a place where there's going to be a team that competes in an SEC championship that is going to be fringe in the top 12. I just don't think Alabama is fringe at this point if they win out. I think a loss, barring a 3-touchdown loss to Texas, you're in pretty good position. If they were in a weakened state, I could say, okay, you want to avoid it entirely. But again, the way it's shaken out, it kind of just this is the path, and you sort of roll with it, and it's a good thing. You obviously want to get that first round bye. You want to be feeling good about it, about where you are. Texas doesn't look like the most invincible team on the planet right now. So it's an interesting matchup. We'll just have to see if it plays out that way.
And it's tough to figure out which team would be left out if Alabama does make it as a 10-3 SEC championship game loser. I think it makes it easier if Indiana just gets boat raced by Ohio State, and then I think you can say a 9-1 Indiana with no quality wins is really the team you would leave out. But if Indiana plays Ohio State tough on the road and that's a close game and they lose and that's their only loss,
I'm just saying the fact that they don't all play each other is going to lend to these debates, especially when you do have a common opponent.
I think if a 10-3 Alabama loses the SEC championship game, they would have to get in over Indiana or Tennessee. Those would be their two likeliest. Maybe Ole Miss. That's where you're trying to sneak in is past one of those teams. And you lose the head-to-head with Tennessee. I don't know if that's the end-all be-all. You do have the head-to-head win over Georgia, but I feel like Georgia's resume after this Tennessee game is going to look pretty good. Their strength of schedule, their win over Texas. At that point, you would have lost to Texas if you're going to use the transitive property. Ole Miss's strength of schedule is not great, but they would have a win over Georgia. And you're trying to pick one of those teams to leave out. And that would be a very controversial, very difficult exercise, especially if Notre Dame doesn't screw up and they're in there too. Penn State's just sitting there. And I agree. Like in a situation, if you're Penn State, that is a situation where I think it certainly benefits them not to go to Indianapolis. Like that's kind of the poster child for it makes sense not to play in a conference championship game. But I feel like Alabama in the position that they've been, it makes sense.
That's why where you start in the playoffs in the rankings does sort of matter.
Because
it's harder to climb than it is to fall.
Right. And it's it's not written in stone like why Penn State and Indiana and Notre Dame are ahead of Alabama. There's a recency bias to all of this. Like let's acknowledge that because that first ranking was right after Alabama lost to Tennessee or a week after. I think it was right after the Missouri game maybe, but that loss was still fresh in everybody's minds. And Tennessee was much higher. And now everybody's high on Georgia because they just beat Tennessee, but a week ago they lost to Ole Miss and they lost out. It's always like, what have you done for me lately? And I feel like Tennessee is getting a little bit screwed because of that, because of the timing of when they played. If Alabama went to Tennessee this past weekend and they lost the same exact game they lost 3 weeks ago, people would have Tennessee ranked ahead of Alabama. But the fact that it was 4 weeks ago, kind of softens the blow a little bit. So timing is still important, but you're right. Like where you start in the rankings, it's hard to move up or down. In Alabama's case, it's going to be hard to move up without winning the SEC championship because you just don't have those wins left on your schedule with Oklahoma and Auburn.
It's going to be interesting to see where the committee puts Tennessee, what it means moving forward, and how they ultimately judge Ohio State, Indiana, how they ultimately judge Tennessee after losing to Georgia. Very curious to see what that means. We'll discuss all of that on Thursday's show. Tuesday's show, we're going to try to link up with the Sooners Illustrated, the Oklahoma 24/7 site, to preview Alabama, Oklahoma, which is coming up this Saturday in Norman. That's a 6:30 kickoff. That is all we've got for today's show. There's a lot to discuss between not just the game itself, but also like the other games that happened, what it means for the SEC, what it means for the college football playoff. It's almost like the people in charge, they may not have all their ducks together, but by golly, we know how to create content out of it. So here we are with a 40-minute show on 52-7 and other things that happened this weekend. But yeah, that's the rough plan for this week. I'm going to link up with Sooners Illustrated on Tuesday, link back up with the gang here on Thursday to discuss the playoff rankings, preview Alabama, Oklahoma a little bit more in depth. But yeah, that's all we've got on today's show. In the meantime, before we return later this week, be sure to rate and review this show wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, even our Bama 247 YouTube page. Subscribe to Bama 247 and 24/7 Sports for all of this expert coverage and analysis on Alabama football, as well as Alabama men's basketball, because they play in Birmingham against Illinois this Wednesday. We're going to be there. We're going to have coverage of that game, continued coverage of the Crimson Tide, both men's basketball and football. It's November. It's going to be a really busy month. We don't want you guys to miss a thing. So be sure to subscribe. As always, we appreciate you guys for listening. We'll talk to y'all again soon.